Thank you, everyone, for coming to this talk. As you can see, we have a yellowish tone. It doesn't say much about that. I think we need to embrace change in impact, and we cannot predict everything. But let's continue, and I will try to do the best job possible to show the colors I actually wanted to show to you. So a little bit about myself before I get started on the content. So my background is working in technology for last 20 years. For the last 10 years, I had the fortunity of working with different leadership positions. So I was at Zalando for close to 5 years. I was with GS Shop, which was an LG e-commerce in Southeast Asia. And also, at the moment, I'm with On. This is a sports brand based out of Zurich in Switzerland. And we are known for interesting shoes and also now apparels focused on sports. And the first question I get when I talk to people about On is like, what is technology at On? Why are you even thinking about evolutionary architectures at On? And I have to then explain the whole story. So what I did was, instead of explaining the story to every single person all the time, I thought maybe I can actually pitch a presentation and share a little bit of what I'm doing right now at On, but also building upon my experience around architecture and agility across different organizations. Just for context, when I started at Zalando, it was, I think, fashion store was around 80 to 100 people. I left, it was 800. GS started with 10 people from a technology, 2010, 2011. And when I left, it was like 2,000, 3,000 employees. When I started On, it was like 10 people building the entire e-commerce system. Now it's close to 40 people, and we have a broader technology organization. So I could say I have my share of seeing different type of agility and architecture problems across different organizations or different scale. So yeah, I'm at On, and I can't give you discounts. So that's all I can say. So again, reminder, if you have questions, I love having questions. If I don't get the questions and I don't get a time to address the questions, please raise those questions. I'll be happy to reach out to you the rest of the day to talk about that. And don't forget the room. So maybe a quick show of hands and maybe voice out. We don't have mics. But what is the word that comes to your mind when you hear evolutionary architecture as a phrase? What's a term that comes to mind? Anybody wants to shout out? Fitness functions. Unstable. Anyone? Adaptable. I'm looking for more controversial points. Say it again. Mental things out. Say it again. Contradiction. Continuous change. Sometimes when I present this internally and different people say complex, theoretical, idealistic. So I hear these terms as well. So just to give you more items in your vocabulary. What I realized is across the length and breadth of the conference the last 2 days, there are a lot of good talks. Often you will not remember everything in that talk. There's just one small idea or a big idea. So I thought maybe if you don't get anything in this presentation, I hope this slide summarizes. It's like one slide version of the entire content. So if you want to step out and go into the other presentation, you can do so just after this slide. So the key message I'm trying to communicate, and I'm not selling anything, I'm not pitching anything, is one, try to make technical decisions in your organization, your teams, either as late or as soon as possible, but not in between. And enable your teams to understand the difference. When do they need to go late and when do they need to go soon? One metric that you need to optimize for, and around other metrics that actually you will work with, is how's your architecture helping you to make your future decisions cheaper? How does architecture make your cost of making decisions, a future decision, less over time? And software architecture is not just about engineering. It's about stakeholders, customers, and bringing them along early in the journey. So we'll talk about that, see some of this in example. And lastly, the less you need to decide soon, the better. So this is the key message. The meat, the tofu, and the rest is just the subtle details around that. But I'll come to this slide later. Okay, a lot of the content in this presentation will be about decision making, and I want to provoke, sometimes annoy, also allow you to think, but maybe align on some ideas. So not everything will work in your environment, in your context. Your mileage will vary. But again, focusing on the decision making element around evolutionary architecture. And the last detail, I want to kind of keep this question in front of you. I'll ask this question back again at the end. If you can guess what is the architecture of my presentation right at the end of my presentation, that'll be amazing. And this is also one way to make sure everybody's paying attention. So the clues are all over. All right, let's get some details. So define trench. So often in a trench, in an environment your teams are working, you are working with a complex system. I think we heard a lot about what complex system is, and it is not. And essentially what your teams, architects, product managers, all customers and stakeholders are dealing with is, how do we operate this complex system? How does it work? What happens when it breaks? And how do we add new stuff? So essentially, the four things. This is the trench. You're dealing with this on an ongoing basis, on a daily basis. Let's define the wild. Some of it kind of resonates with you if you were in the panel yesterday, you're looking at the panel yesterday. So one, the complex system has some wild ideas around it. So let's look at it one by one. So you see ad hoc adoption of shiny new tech, the LLMs and generative AI technologies, the new languages on the board of frameworks. Everybody wants to adopt that. So one symptom of the wild is adoption, but ad hoc adoption. You see teams that cannot agree on decision. Agree is quite important term here. And you see new services just sprouting up. Suddenly see new services in your dashboard. And the communication costs increases over time, right? So this is the wild that I am assuming a lot of you face. I faced it at every single place I worked with. And my goal is to share my journey, some of the practices, not a lot of which is to be radically new. I think you heard a lot of it, but just to show how it actually looks like in the real world. And dealing with the wild, working in the trenches. I see the topics around evolutionary architecture. You can start extracting principles. In my panel discussion yesterday, I had the fortune of actually sharing with amazing people on the panel. And I think for me, I was using the term principles a lot. And I want to share some principles that I derived and my teams have derived over the last many years, working directly or indirectly with the concepts of evolutionary architecture. And I will go quickly over them and then see some of it in action. So one, there's a control loop that exists. What do we mean by control loop? So fitness of your architecture is reviewed. It's not fitness function, it's just fitness. And upcoming product and business changes are reviewed to see if we need to make new decisions. If you see this QR code, that's basically a link to the Slidos. You can ask a question, scan it again. Just a reminder. So the fitness means here is you're asking this question, is your current state of architecture capable enough to meet the change in characteristics? If you have read the book about evolutionary architecture, I think characteristics is an interesting element in that. So essentially around security, leverageability, extensibility. How is your architecture set up in such a way that it's able to meet that change, adapt to that change? And that is the constant conversation that you are having with your teams on a daily basis. And we'll see some examples of that in further slides. Continuous learning. So what does it mean? Education about architecture is a constant part. One way I have seen it working is new joiners. Whenever we have new engineers, product managers, project managers, stakeholders, commercial members who join in, they are engaged with the architecture. It's not only meant for engineers. We basically run the sessions with them, talking about history, talking about decisions, bad, good decisions, characteristics, and the upcoming changes that we see we need to start thinking about as part of framing the architecture. So you see, it's a continuous learning exercise. Without that, we cannot move forward. So you can inculcate new joiner onboarding. So every new joiner goes through that irrespective of the level, irrespective of the role. They need to engage with that. Continuous feedback. What does it mean? Every team member is actually asked to provide feedback and also given feedback if they're breaking a decision. So for example, if teams are making their own decision about building a new service, adding a new logic, they at least know if they're breaking a decision. And that will lead to a variance, which is not a bad thing, but at least we want to make the variances tracked and visualize. What do? We actually convert the variances as failed test cases. So every team, when they run their CI jobs or deployments, they see, oh, I have a failed test case, and I know it's because of this particular variance. So I went to do something that was not aligned with an existing decision that we made, but there's a context behind it. But at least I know there's a variance that I need to come back to. I need to deal with it. And I think you may have heard last year, variances aren't justly bad. It's a good thing. But you need to track it. It's not lost. People should be able to review that on an active basis. Design for inclusivity, design for inclusion. What does it mean? We make it easier for team members to be able to access and update architecture, engage with that. It's not behind a sign-up form or kind of an isolated wiki page. It's accessible, and they're using it on a daily basis. And making sure, as part of enablement, everybody knows how is the architecture visualized. And the tooling and the processes. I'm using the bad P word, process. To keep the architecture understanding simple and trivial, it's part of the development process. How do we do that? For example, we obviously try to leverage architecture documentation as a code, but also incorporate in the pull request review. So for example, every code repository has obviously a YAML or some level of tooling that allows them to document that change, and actually developers can go and make those changes right next to the implementation. Secondly, we also incorporate changes in the pull request. So here's a snapshot of one of the repositories we use. It's, are you also going to update the relevant architecture visualization relevant for this change? So it is tracked, it's visible. It's not just left for people to remember. It's actually very upfront about our teams. And I think these are some of the principles that we try to adopt across the organizations that I've worked with. Design for understandability. This is my favorite. I'm coming from e-commerce space, and often the most common question is, why is add to cart so slow? And the question we basically want to answer is our architecture designed in such a way that we can understand this problem, this question, and anybody can ask this problem. Anybody can ask this question through identifying what is the associated metric and the thresholds relevant for that operation. So what is the underlying metric that is connected to add to cart? Who is the maintainer of the operation? Which team is the maintainer of this operation? Can I get access to the telemetry information? And are there associated architecture decisions documented, recorded? Even characteristics and visualization. If you use C4, are there relevant level 3, level 4, which are relevant for this operation? And I think design for understandability is critical to be able to leverage evolutionary architecture in your organization. And I highly recommend thinking through that, not just in an operation view, but essentially development view of it. So we talked about some of the principles that we derived. Now, how do we apply this in practice? What does it look like? And if you remember, the first point in the summary was slow and fast, thinking slow and fast book, right? So I'm trying to kind of borrow that ideas from there. If you start auditing in your organization, just look at the past decisions, small or big, that your teams have made over the last years. What are the decisions that actually have been taken fast, should have been slow, and vice versa? And is there a taxonomy that you can start sharing it with your team to decide what needs to be slow, what needs to be fast? I will double click into it. I want to quickly pitch a book from Shane Parrish, which is actually releasing this week. Highly recommend that. clear thinking, which kind of double downs on this idea. It doesn't relate to software architecture, but I think it's kind of more high level, but very relevant. And I think that book talks about the kind of the Eisenhower matrix. And I think it's super relevant when you start making architecture decisions. Every decision, big or small, should be on this decision matrix. So on the top, you have a high consequence, irreversible decision, top right. You likely want to be slow there. And I'll show you what does slow mean in a moment. And if you go on the other quadrants, let's go there. Slow if you can, but not necessarily, because it's reversible. So you can throw money at the problem, for example. Anything on the bottom quadrants, you want to be fast, which means letting the teams closest to the problem and the impact of the decision make the decision. And I will show you also practices that you can do that in your teams if you want to try this out. This is a snippet from the internal FAQ that we have. Some of principal engineers worked on it. So if you can't read it, I'll probably say it again. So there's a question that we're asking for teams before they make a decision. Does this engagement initiative require decisions that are difficult or costly to reverse? Again, it's a kind of a question format of this picture. What it says is a decision is costly when it's to reverse, when you want to reverse it, it will require breaking existing contracts, maybe breaking contracts with third-party services if you're working with, or requiring multiple teams. The blast radius is that much. And we also put the constraint of time. So it will also require at least 1 quarter and affects the roadmap of the team. And these are essentially constraints, good or bad, we give to our teams to decide about whether they need to make this decision quickly, which is in their teams, in their domain, so move fast, or they need to go slow. And we have few more questions around that. And I think what we're doing is giving these teams the ability to decide for themselves by thinking through this framework. What does it mean by fast? Fast is affected team taking the decision, obviously. You have a structured process of making this fast decision that is not unique for each team. So every team knows how to make this fast decision. Hence the codification of that into a process, into a documentation. So structured, replicable process that works fairly for all teams. Access to a forum to reconsider decisions. So if you remember, if you're making a fast decision, you're likely going to make a bad decision. That's okay. But can you also find a forum to reconsider? Without that, we live on with the outcomes of a bad decision at that point in time. So what is a forum that you want to use to reconsider without judgment? So think about it like doing retrospectives, postmortems, potentially premortems if you're starting to think about a decision. But again, forum to reconsider decision and change the decision. It's okay. But also, I enjoy that a lot, demo, showcase, and share out. So asking your teams, please tell me, what was the decision that you made in the last months that made you to go fast? How did it work out? And sharing with other teams. So it becomes a kind of a learning taxonomy instead of just writing everything down. So periodically running demos where teams showcase, here was the decision that we made about this problem. It's not a significant decision. We made it fast. This happened out of it. This is what we learned. Do we want to replicate this for other decision? Yes or no? And I think we do that constantly. And it touches upon the topic of continuous learning and continuous feedback. What does it mean by going slow? Slow means creating artificial slowness. What does it look like? Peer reviews. So asking for teams to get other teams' feedback, even if they are not closely connected, just as a third-party feedback. Aligning on principle and values. Are there underlying principles and values of your team, of your business, that you're optimizing on? If there's a misalignment on this principle and values, it needs to be corrected. And hence, the notion of going slow. And if you remember what was the snippet from the FAQ, if you see a high consequence, irreversible decision, ideally you want the process to go slow. And here you are basically creating those indicators to help your team to go slow. Slow doesn't mean just take the time you need, but essentially it has a method around that. Again, a replicable and consistent process, so everybody knows it's fair. If a team says, I think this is a consequential, irreversible decision. I need to go slow. Okay, what is the process for that? I don't want to increase the cognitive load of devising a new process to go slow. And my favorite, start with async in the beginning, but don't remain async in the end. What does it mean? If you're making a decision which is high consequence, likely irreversible, maybe it starts with a document that you're pairing, maybe a peer-reviewed, a pull request, a draft pull request. But as soon you start getting feedback, don't just let it simmer and in async trying to maybe organize a meeting or a catch-up or a conversation. And this has worked because often we've seen that a slow decision just takes too long. And I think the sync basically creates the need to make a decision. Or say we will not decide. That's also a decision. The other practice, which I've seen it working in my current teams and also previous teams who have embraced these ideas around constraints. And I think the speakers in the last 2 days have talked about constraints a lot, so I'll keep it simple. Few constraints: time to market, budget, architecture decisions that have already been made, and the shelf life of solution, ready for deletion. If you remember, there was a term that was used. How do you think about using those constraints? And without these constraints, it's not going to happen. It will just take too long. It will just burn people. So essentially what I'm proposing here is, if you want to democratize decision making and in an evolutionary environment, you cannot have any architecture decision without these constraints. And if you're actually making a decision and the constraints are not visible, it is a good indicator that something is wrong. So talk to people. We are incentivizing the teams to talk to other teams, to the other stakeholders closer to customer or proxy of a customer to make sure they know the constraints. And I showed you some of the examples in the previous slide. We also review the constraints on an ongoing basis. Are these even constraints relevant? Is shelf life relevant anymore? Is the budget relevant anymore? I think if you don't do that, it just becomes dogmatic. So think about what constraints you can validate. So for example, shelf life. If a particular decision and the implications of it have a shelf life 3 years, why 3? Why not 2? What's the outcome of if you have it 3 years or 2 years or 1 year? How do you even come up with 1 year? And I think this is basically giving you a way to think about these constraints without just succumbing to a constraint just because somebody wrote it. So having also a review exercise within those constraints, and I think those constraints will be different for your setup. For example, in a regulation, high compliant business, there might be more constraints to make. Every decision that you want to make in an architecture setting is obviously a socio-technical activity. You're involving people early on, not just the engineers in the room. But how do you start doing that, and what it looks like? I started making it simpler. Usually it's not that linear, but let's maybe for the sake of this presentation make it linear, right? So problem discovery, there's a problem. We need to solve this problem. For that, we need to make a decision. We identify what's the root problem. We thought about solutions, not just one. What's the solution vector? How do you implement the solution? How does it really work? And how can we iterate? Now, across these phases, what you are doing is asking a lot of questions, and there you have a right point to engage with different other people in the system. So not just engineers, but peers, business and commercial stakeholders, even customers. For example, from problem discovery to understanding, you're asking, how do we know if the problem actually gets solved? And I think this is a question you can use to almost spark conversations, have the socio-technical interaction with other roles. Same, from problem understanding to solution proposals. How do we know if a particular solution or solutions is aligned with the existing decisions that we have made, maybe from a product strategy, from a business strategy, from a technical strategy? How do we know it's aligned? Who should we talk to make sure I know if a solution is aligned? How do we know the solution is implemented correctly? Obviously, so how do we test it, making sure it has satisfied all the requirements, at least on that context? And how do we know it's continually solved the problem? It's not just one time. It's continually solving the problem and actually solving for good. And I think these questions are almost as examples that you could use to start engaging with other roles. And there could be more. These are some representative example. Again, the best ideas and best decisions have often been seen as an engagement with different roles. It's not just the engineer making a decision about an architecture. This is my favorite again. Measure what matters. The measurement of your architecture, as I was saying in the summary, is how you're making your future decision cheaper. What does cheap mean? Cheap does not mean it's a bad decision. The time it takes, the lead time of making a decision, the amount of people and conversations to have or decisions, the amount of noise that you need to sift through, it's also a part of the cost of that decision. So you start thinking about cheap decisions. There's a negative connotation to it, but what I want to rally on here is your architecture set up in such a way that when I want to make a decision as a team member, it does not require completely shifting my entire organization to a different planet, essentially making the architect decisions cheaper. How do we do that? Some ideas. One, practice reducing snowflake implementation, right? I think there was a mention about enabling teams, in some context, principal engineers, really working on and talking to different teams to make sure, are there snowflake implementations of the same problem? And can we start reducing that? Because reducing snowflake implementation means it's one step forward to make your decisions cheaper. The other, what can be turned into a commodity? Are there any primitives that can be turned into commodity? If you remember Susanne's talk yesterday about Wardley mapping, you saw on the right extreme, what is commodity? And I think, what is a product that you can buy off the shelf? And essentially, the more of your underlying primitives you start treating as commodity, and I'm not saying just go out to a third-party provider and just give it to them, but treating as a commodity, which means the cost of running that primitive, operating and changing that primitive is extremely low for you. That will reduce the amount of decisions you want to make. So a commodity means you don't have to forget about it. I don't have to worry about electricity here. I don't have to worry about I have to worry about my projector setup, which is a different thing. I thought it's a commodity, but maybe if I have to start thinking about everything as non-commodity, it increases the cost of that decision and makes it expensive. So some examples for you to really think about, how do you practice cheap decisions? I think we're almost at the tail end of the session. And please remember the question that I asked in the beginning. What is the architecture of my presentation? So don't forget that. It's coming soon. If you go out speaking to anyone in your organization, everybody has different definition of what is architecture. Let's show some definitions. So how are different systems connected? What technologies do we use? What capabilities we offer through our product? How are teams working? And everybody has different interpretation about what architecture is. One way to start thinking about and getting away from an ivory tower architect, a review board, is thinking about working groups. In the definition that I have engaged with, the working group is basically an interdisciplinary group of people on rotation, so we rotate that group members, who are responsible and also incentivized, which means we measure the effectiveness through that incentive, to help self-governed teams make decisions by themselves, but in a predictable manner, in a fair manner. So it doesn't mean we have some teams for whom there's a new process and it just works well for them, but not for the others. So making it a predictable, fair manner. And that's their goal, the working group's goal, to do that. And they do that obviously through various means. One, through education. So we employ senior engineers, architects, principal engineers who focus on education through outreach. So they're talking to ecosystem, coaching the engineers, coaching the teams on a regular basis. Governance via code, which means you don't have to come to my office hours to get an approval. Can I do it on a code? Can we do it pair? Can we review this together? Can we work on this? Can we mob on this together? And is it visible in the code? Enablement through pairing. So again, making sure that they're not just sitting and talking about how do we help engineers make right decisions, how we help, but also they're engaged, embedded into teams. So the enablement through pairing really creates also a skin in the game for that working group. The working group members, by the way, are not some specific group of people. It's not an architecture team in some of the contexts I have worked with. They are part of existing teams. They are incentivized 30% of their time to work in the working group, which means it's reflected in the calendar. Their managers are aware of it. The HRs is aware of it. It's part of their role expectation. And lastly, expertise propagation. So if there is a missing knowledge, what can I do to take that knowledge and bring into the teams? So everybody wants to adopt generative AI, LLMs in your product. There's an expertise gap. Let's put aside the argument that you need to find a right use case. But if you have an expertise gap, how is the working group really enabling teams to fill that expertise? And how do you propagate that? And that's the kind of a core missions of the working group. One of the missions of working group, just maybe double clicking on that, is helping to make architecture decisions, helping the teams to make. And if you remember that diagram, so on the top quadrants, it's architecturally significant decisions, so slow or slow if you can. And you can do a review process. And what review process is, again, like a pull request review. What you are doing there in that review process through conversation with the team, you are detecting, is there an inherent decision made in the proposal, in the implementation proposal, or the change itself that is likely a significant decision. So which means we need to go slow. So if you remember the slow indicators. And what you're doing is giving them element of cost, exposing that cost to the teams. And that idea is to not wait for permission. So engage with the working group, get the feedback, expose the cost to the teams who are making the decision. And if it's likely a significant one, raise the visibility of that to other teams. So we do that by monthly share out. We review our state of union in terms of architecture and our end system, where we look at different parameters to decide how healthy, how fit our architecture is. This is kind of, we have a preamble of sorts, weird, but I just took out a particular line item which is very interesting. It's mandate for working groups so that we all know how we are operating. Distribute decision-making authority, so allowing people closest to the problem, closest to the domain, closest to the customer to make the right decision at point, given the context. And if this mandate is not being practiced by the working group, we review that as well. What are the occasions in the last month where maybe a decision is required, a working group to come in and break the ties? And if that's happening, which basically means we need to fix this. Close to 5 minutes, almost there. Not super important, but this is, I'm happy to share the slide, but this was an example of how we actually kickstarted the working group. We did a discovery, outcome, and governance term, but here is all about, are the teams aware of how to evolve the system, how they react to a change, how do they listen to new requirement, new changes coming in? Are they speaking to the customer, speaking to all the stakeholders? And essentially, this was a framework that we then used to make sure the working group is successful. Because not supporting this working group means the blast radius of that propagates across the organization. Architecture is also not about regulation, right? So we're not regulating, we're not policing. So we don't want to have an environment that penalizes builders by building a lot of rules and processes and other negative incentives. I think one word you also want to take away from here, part of the summary, is incentive. Very important. Focus on fast and automated feedback. So if there is no automated or no fast feedback, likely this will not stick. It still requires a manual intervention, which means we have a problem. Obviously, build learning muscle. Are the coach being coached? Less is more. We have seen a good set focus on as limited set of fitness functions and significant decisions that people need to remember. Again, cognitive load. The more it is, likely it will not stick. Start simple, start small, and treat constraints as forcing function. I think often we treat budget, time to market as a very ugly thing. Oh, if we had more money, or if we had more time. We see it as more forcing function, and we use that like in conversation. Oh, if we had more time, what else could we do? What does the architecture scope change if we had more budget? And I think that forcing function mindset helps us to treat constraints more positively. So let's bring it all together. So you saw this picture of wild scenario, people adopting shiny new tech, my beautiful drawing on the left. How do we approach it? So develop scenarios where your teams can experiment with new technology. It's okay to try out shiny new tech, but give them the ability, the scenario where they can test it, where they can learn from it, which means we also have some minimal systems in place. Build, test, release, monitor to make sure that they can use it for experimentation. How do we make sure teams agree on a decision? Apply the matrix. How do we make sure new services starts popping up? Think about decisions that help and guide the teams to know when is the right indicator for building a new service versus not. And the smaller number of fitness functions are built and maintained together. So there. Lastly, the communication cost increases. So, you're making sure ADRs are maintained and incentivized to be updated. You have challenger sessions. I'm happy to go into details if you have more questions. Challenger session is also a session that we do where we just ask people to come in and just like red team that decision. Ask as much of critical question, make sure that the decision is wrong, and challenge that and come with that approach. It also creates a safe environment when they know it's a challenging moment. And create easy to access documents. Again, documentation is critical. I think it just worked really well in my experience. Some snippet of that. So again, this is an internal tool. We have a kind of, do I need an ADR? What are those indicators? So we provide this guidance. We have a page for our teams to go back to templates for ADRs. It's a consistent process. So everybody knows how to document it, what to use it for. And I think teams also use for non-significant decisions. So they use the same format because it works. Concluding thoughts. I think your mileage will vary. Think about reducing the cost of your decision. Think about ways you can democratize decision making, but really pull some principles and values. Without that, your teams are going in all directions, but also give autonomy. As I think David, who mentioned autonomy comes with responsibility and accountability, so build that. But my question for you, what was my architecture of the presentation? Does anybody know the answer? Yes. Big ball of mud. I think that's a feedback. So the architecture of my presentation was, I made a lot of changes to this presentation, even the right moment. So applying what I'm talking about was this slide. I want to make sure this story lands, and whatever the fluff I can build around it is okay. But if that story does not land, then it's not going in the right direction. So the essence here is the architecture has to be simple. It's not guardrails and policing, but some kind of basis fundamental ideas. And then your teams can actually start making autonomous decisions. Small plug, if you have engineering leaders who are starting up, I have actually run boot camps. I'm running in October, November, and December. And with that, thank you so much. I think we have 1 minute, maybe?
Yes, we got 1 minute.
Lovely.
55 questions, so you have to speak really fast. So what is the best and worst outcome of challenging session?
Best and worst outcome. That's a great question. The best outcome is people know that there are challengers in the room, which means they can go out and engage with them and bring them actively. The worst outcome, it becomes an unhealthy match of trying to prove that my point is better, and there we need good moderation and facilitation.
Okay, thank you. Can you give a concrete example for decision-making tools you've used successfully, please?
Yeah, I think the biggest was around, we were modernizing, coming from a large ball of mud to a more service-oriented setup. And we say that we will limit the changes to our existing set. And we also gave indicators for teams to kind of understand what changes are okay to make, but also keep responsibility of those changes, and where I think it's likely better to move it off and how you can do that. I think that was one of the biggest successful decision. Everybody adopted to that. There was feedback around it, but also we built tooling. Our platform teams built tooling to make sure that decision actually works in practice. So teams engage with decision. It was actively reviewed, and we also had a shelf life of that decision. So people know at that time that decision is no longer relevant.
Thank you very much. Let us thank Vivek again.
Thank you.